Good morning, y'all. My name is Ben, one of the pastors here, and just real quick, I know today is one of the biggest days in our nation, so I just want to acknowledge that. It's Groundhog Day. And in case you hadn't heard the good news, spring is supposed to come quick this year, so there's your good news. And I'm sure some of you have been like waking up this morning praying for a football team called the Chiefs. Am I right? It is Go Chiefs Day, and to support that, I'm wearing the, and you got to know, I have this shirt because I lost a bet with Pastor Rick 3 years ago. I am a diehard Saints fan. I'm a Louisiana boy, and I'll say Go Chiefs, but what you don't understand is that as Cajun people, when we say go, there's a slight inflection that you don't hear. It's actually spelled like this. So when I say Go Chiefs, this is what I mean. So hopefully today will be a good day for everybody who's a Chiefs fan. If not, then hey, next Sunday we're going to worship. You can come and lament and ask God for forgiveness for all the bad things you're going to say today about the 49ers. If they win, you can come next week and we'll worship, and you can thank God for His grace for today. How's that for a deal? All right. The other service was much more into the Chiefs than you are, I guess. How about this? How many of you know the name Felix Baumgartner? A few do. Felix Baumgartner, he's a stuntman. He rode 24 miles up into the air in a capsule suspended from a balloon so that he could jump out of it and have the world's highest free fall. 24 miles. He achieved the speed of 833 miles an hour, which means that is faster than the speed of sound. And according to the experts, that makes him the only person, just as a person, to create a sonic boom. Now, my kids have said for years I create sonic booms, but the experts say, nope, that's not the sonic boom we're looking for. It is Felix Baumgartner who did it. And here's the thing, as Felix was interviewed about this, they asked him, were you afraid? Were you scared? And this guy's a stuntman. He has jumped off of some of the tallest buildings. He has actually raced an airplane by free falling, meaning he's not in an airplane, trying to race an airplane. And this is what he said. They asked, are you afraid? He said, you wouldn't be human if you weren't afraid. He said, if something goes wrong up there, it only takes 15 seconds and I'm dead. He went on to say that his biggest fear around all of this wasn't the speed or the height, that the biggest fear he had actually was he is claustrophobic. And he had to spend 7 hours in this spacesuit in a small capsule before he could even jump. He said he took 5 years to prepare for this jump, especially 5 years with his therapist, so he can somehow psychologically get through the closed space. And what I love about this story is this is a story of overcoming. This is a story where Felix Baumgartner felt the fear, but he did it anyway. And there are going to be times in life you're going to feel fear, but you need to do it anyway. And when we're in this series called All In, listen, there's going to be some fear. And what do you do with fear? Do you just ignore it? You just pretend it's not there? Do you push it away and hope somebody else will take care of it? Or maybe God has something to do with our fears. That's what I want to get into today. Before I do that, just to highlight again, there's a place to take some notes in your program when you get here on Sunday, so please don't hesitate to do that. And if you're here last week, we handed out a workbook, and if you need one, go ahead and raise your hand. Pastor Rick will get those passed out. Inside this is really kind of talking about this in a larger scale, what we're talking about over the next 4 or 5 weeks plus around something called the All In Initiative and what it looks like to be all in on this mission into the future. There's study guides in here. There's weekly devotionals for you individually as well as with your group. I believe today starts around page 16. So please go ahead and use that. If you need one, just raise your hand. Pastor Rick will get one. You can also grab one out in the lobby. We've got a table out there that says All In, and you can grab one out there. So back to fear. There have been times in life, all throughout history, that people have felt this sense of fear when it comes to being all in with God. The early followers of Jesus, we talked about this last week, they had this moment where they had to decide, am I really all in? Because they, like us, when we come to faith, it first starts with a consumeristic mindset. Because we believe in Jesus or we experience something, and Jesus is doing something for us. Our spiritual ancestors experienced this. Their first encounter with Jesus was in the flesh, and he would feed them, or he would do a miracle, he would heal somebody, and so it was something that they got out of it. Just like us, sometimes when we start to follow Jesus, all of a sudden life feels a little bit better. We feel like we have a hope or a purpose, or it makes me a better parent or a better spouse, a better friend. Maybe it keeps you sober. Maybe it gives you some sort of values that are better than what you used to have, or some values that you can pass along to your kids. Maybe it's about connecting in community. And listen, all of those things are benefits to following Jesus. These are good gifts that God gives us. And at some point, though, you got to ask yourself, am I really a follower of Jesus? Meaning, am I all in? Is it more than just getting the good stuff from Jesus? But as we talked about last week, Jesus says, and actually to follow me, you're going to have to deny yourself, deny the good things that you get, pick up a cross, and actually follow him. It's going to cost you something. That's what we're talking about. I'm convinced the one thing, the number one thing it is, between somebody saying, I am completely all in with Jesus or not, is fear. It's the fear factor. It's the fear factor that's present in almost every all-in moment in life. Like the first time you ask somebody to go on a date with you. You know, they're a little fearful. I remember when I proposed to Tammy, that whole moment was fraught with fear. It was so thick, you can cut it with a knife. And I'm not talking about my fear, it's her fear. She's like, oh no, what did he just do? Fortunately, I did it when there was nobody else around, so it didn't put her in a public space. But you could tell, she was a little bit afraid. Marriage, that's a big step. Better or worse, life, how long is this guy going to live? All these things before she had to make that decision. Every time there's an all-in moment, there's fear. Maybe it's to start a new business, or to finally retire, or to move from one job or to another, or to pick a school to go to. There's always fear. Starting a faith journey, there's fear in that. The fear factor is something that we have to confront in every important decision in life. And it's no different when it comes to our spiritual life. There's going to come a moment where you have to ask yourself, am I all in? Now, we pick up where Rick left last week in the book of Acts. The disciples had that moment. Remember, everything they had gotten was from Jesus at this point. Jesus did some incredible stuff, and at this moment, the crowds keep following Jesus. When you read in your Gospels, you'll see oftentimes Jesus would get away from the crowd so he can have some solitude, or he'd push out in a boat to get out in the water so he can address the crowds because there was just so many of them. He was popular, but listen, that popularity didn't last long. Once Jesus went from providing something for them that would amaze them or make them feel good or to feed them, and he starts to challenge them or call them to sacrifice, the people started to leave, except for the people that wanted Jesus out of the picture. Those people always stuck around. In fact, that was the last crowd around him at his crucifixion. But every time Jesus called people to sacrifice, they left him. And then Jesus is crucified, and he's buried, and he raises from the dead. And after that, he spends about 40 days with his disciples, teaching them and showing them what they need to do whenever he is going to leave. Because in that moment, you would think that with a resurrected Jesus, they would have it all figured out, but they didn't. You see, at this point, he still has to recorrect what they think the future is. Because at that point, they saw Jesus dead. They saw him alive. They knew that he was indeed the Son of God. And in their minds, they're thinking to themselves, all right, this is what we've been waiting for our whole lives. This is what our ancestors have been waiting for. Finally, we've got somebody that can come in and kick Roman butt and kick them out, and we get our country back, and then we can be in charge, and our political party can be in charge. I'm kind of making the modern-day parallel here, you see. They think to themselves, in fact, in one of the Gospels, you'll read it, they ask Jesus, Jesus, when you finally come into all of your glory, which one of us is going to be your right-hand man? Which one's going to be your vice president? Which one's going to be your secretary of state? Which one? You get the idea. This is their mindset. And yet Jesus constantly pushed against it, saying essentially, listen, you've got this screwed up vision of what the kingdom looks like. You want your kingdom. Instead, I want God's kingdom, which is what we pray in the Lord's Prayer. Your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven, not mine. And so he has to redirect them all the time, essentially making them have to do an all-in moment once again. The fear factor for them starts to play a role. Anytime Jesus or anybody challenges you to do something or redirect your thinking, there is fear. And at some point, you've got to ask yourself, what do you do with fear? For them, to follow Jesus exactly the same way he lived his life and not just instantly take everything over meant they would have to sacrifice. In fact, they saw his sacrifice. It was called a cross. And they saw the result of a cross. And to them, if the very Son of God defines greatness as going to a cross, then what does it mean for them? Are they willing to do it? All in. How do you spend your time when you're afraid? I tell you how the disciples did. It says this, that then the apostles returned to Jerusalem from the hill called the Mount of Olives on the Sabbath day walk from the city. And just a little detail, Sabbath day walk, what is that? That just means it's a short walk. During the Sabbath day of rest, there's only a certain amount of distance you could walk without it becoming work. And so this was a hill on the other side of Jerusalem. So they traveled back to Jerusalem. They arrived. They went upstairs to the room where they were staying. And it says this, that they all joined together constantly in prayer, along with the women and the Mary, mother of Jesus, and his brothers. I love how they put that detail in it, because often we think that the disciples were just the guys, because in the Bible they like to talk just about guys and not as much about women, but there were women that was following Jesus. And in this moment, Jesus' mom was there, and Jesus' brothers, he had other siblings. And what were they doing? They were continuing to pray. Jesus lays this out to them, and he's like, I'll be all in, and I'm going to send you out there. And they are afraid. And so they pray. Like a lot of people are praying today around football, right? I bet the 49ers are going to gather together and say the Lord's Prayer and deliver us from evil. Actually, deliver us from Patrick Mahomes, please, Lord. That's what they're going to say. And the Chiefs are going to pray. And anytime there is something big, some big moment where you don't even know what the outcome is, man, people pray. They have a little bit of fear, right? Listen, when things are a big deal and you're afraid and you pray, that's a good thing. I want to affirm that. You're driving, you're in a hurry, maybe you're pushing the speed limit a little bit. I know none of you would do that. You're law-abiding citizens. But let's just imagine you might be 5 miles over the speed limit because you're late for school or you're late for church, and you see the lights behind you. What do? You say a little prayer. Please, God, make them go to an accident, not me, right? And then you're like, why did I say an accident? That's horrible. When we're afraid, we pray. Paul knew a lot about this. The man we named this church after, he was the first person to really go out into the world that wasn't Jewish and teach them about Jesus and start churches. And he experienced all sorts of fear, because for Paul, relationally, people threw him out. He was arrested quite often. He was beaten just for talking about Jesus. And yet from prison cells, the scariest places of all, full of fear, he would write letters back to these churches. And like writing to the group in the Philippians, he says this, you know what? Don't worry about anything. Instead, pray about, what's the word? Can you see it? Everything. I mean, this is a guy in prison. Don't worry about anything. Pray about everything. And tell God what you need and thank him for all he has done. And then you will experience God's peace, which exceeds anything we can understand. And his peace will guard your heart and your mind as you live in Christ Jesus. And when you're afraid, when you're terrified, pray. And when you do, this peace in the midst of it can happen. Don't worry. Pray. Because here's what I've learned about myself and worry. Worry is like a conversation that I have with me and myself. Back and forth, about things that I can't control. Who knows what the outcomes are going to be, positive or negative. But prayer is this conversation that I have with God, this back and forth that eventually leads me to the position where, okay, God, I'm going to trust whatever this outcome is. That's the importance of prayer. That's what you see the disciples doing. They are turning their fear and their worry prayer. And it wasn't just a quick, they see the flashing lights come in and please God, make it go away. No, it is, God, I want to be all in with you because I'm afraid. I don't know how. Please show me the way. God, even if it means carrying a cross, show me the way. So let me ask you, what about being all in with Jesus might scare you? I can tell you from experience, and even from still today, being all in with Jesus costs me something. It makes me lose control. Not like I'm crazy or anything, but it makes me lose control of my own life because God asked me to do things that I wouldn't normally do. Being all in with Jesus, maybe it's change. All love change, right? As long as we're ones that are making the change. We hate it when other people make us change. Whenever there's a fear factor, there's an all-in moment. Is God going to infringe on my time? I mean, we ask that question. You know what? I want to follow Jesus. What's he going to ask of my time? Or my friends, my family going to think that I'm a little bit too much into Jesus? Is there only a certain level I should go before people think I'm weird? And for some of you, you're just weird. Just live it out. Live your crazy life out there. Maybe it has to do with generosity. And you're like, you know what, Jesus, yes, I can volunteer. I give you some time. And you know what? I know some accounting or some photography. I can give some of my talents. But, oh, my gosh, my wallet? No, I've got plans for that. And God might ask you to do something you don't want to do. He may ask you to go hang out with people that you don't want to hang out with, like 49ers fans, or the poor, or the ones who are sick. It's an all-in moment, and there's fear in that. God's going to ask you to do some things that you don't think you're capable of. And maybe to the point where he's asking you to change your life drastically for your faith. That's what being all in is. How will you respond? And it's important for us to embrace this individually and as a church. Because historically, what happens, even with a group of people, even with families or an organization, things seem to go great, and you get really comfortable. And you know what? I love it. I love my chair right where it's at until Pastor Rick moves the chairs around. Then I get ticked at Pastor Rick. I love my class. I love all of this stuff. But at some point, you've got to ask yourself, is this still this consumer? I'm getting more from Jesus. Or is Jesus asking me and us to do something more? And we believe that right now is a season for us to be beyond right now in a big way. You know, how do we expand what we're doing when it comes to ministries, and especially with children? How do we identify and lead more people? Here in Carl Junction, how do we actually create space for youth, middle school and high schoolers so that they can connect in a real way in their setting? They don't feel like they're just hanging out in Dad's living room, right? How do you do that? How do you actually, from a facility standpoint, actually make a hospitality, my mouth gets mixed up, and do something out front so that when it rains and when it snows, which seems to be like on Sundays only when it does it, people can pull up and let their wife or their children or their grandfather out without getting soaking wet. It might sound like a little thing, but listen, it's a hospitality thing. It means, hey, you know what? We're throwing a party. We're throwing a Super Bowl party at my house, and I know that it's raining, but I'm going to put something out so that when you come, man, you are welcome. What does it look like to be a church like that? What does it look like to be a church that goes beyond what we're doing to try to intentionally reach the over 50,000 families between here and our Joplin campus, 5-mile radius of both, that have nothing to do with any faith community? It's about having a presence online more than we do now, because I got to tell you, my grandkids, if I ever get grandkids, I'm speaking that into existence, Lord. If I ever get grandkids, they're going to be so much more digitally online than any of us ever imagined. So what does it look like for us to actually intentionally invest into that? That's these big things that we see. What does it look for us to go beyond just, our worship and our classes to actually training people to address the rising rate of suicide in our area? And the two biggest things around suicide are veterans and LGBT youth, whose families have just thrown them out. What does it mean for us to do that? What does it mean for us how do we actually fund and resource raising up leaders and new pastors over the next 10 to 20 years by doing things like internships and mentorship and fellowships and any other ships you can think about? And all in this new season means we look beyond what we like now and ask God, what do you call us to do for the future in ministry and in facilities? Listen, God, I believe, is desperately seeking churches to live out an example of what it looks like that a person is all in for him. Churches that it's not about our comfort and it's not about what we like the most, but it's more about reaching and restoring people that want nothing to do with us or any church. And that's what it means all in. Churches like that, they change the world. Churches that aren't like that, we just have fun with one another. I want to be about a church that changes the world. That's what Jesus called his disciples to do, to be all in, to sacrifice. That's what he asks us to do. Over the next 10 years, 20 years, what does it look like to be all in? I mean, this is just the start of a big vision. A booklet you've got, man, it has so much more detail in there, and you're going to be hearing more about it. But this is a big vision, and if you're a part of this church, if you feel like God's calling you to embrace this, then guess what? You're probably going to feel a little bit scared, or at least you should. I know I am. The idea of what can I sacrifice for the future, it scares me. I can tell you that hearing that, I know it's in me, I know it's in some of you, we can either do what we're used to, which is to ignore it and hope somebody else, a future generation, takes care of it, or we can step up and embrace it and say, God, yes, I'll follow. What will we do with the fear? And it always begins with prayer. That's what I've been doing for months as we've been kind of preparing for this. That's what I'm doing right now. That's what I'm doing to move through our fears with prayer. Finally, maybe finding a way that in spite of the things that make us afraid, we can move through it, knowing that God has brought us to this place for a reason. Listen, if previous generations over the last 180 years, 132 years here in Carl Junction, by the way, if those previous generations then, or 100 years ago, or 50 years ago, or 20 years ago, didn't sit around and pray and think about the future and take a risk, then I would not be here. And we wouldn't have stories like this. I want you to see a story.
I can honestly say that the day that I came to my faith was on the day of the tornado. That was a pretty powerful day for all of Joplin, and I feel like for me specifically, it wasn't until I was pregnant with our son, our first child, that, we kind of decided that we were going to make this a priority in our lives. We had a support system of people who barely knew us, who cared about us. We struggled financially for a really, really long time. People like Pastor Dixie, who on our first Thanksgiving as parents said, I want you guys to have one of our Thanksgiving baskets, to the year after us being able to sponsor one of those Thanksgiving baskets, and so it's been little things like that for the course of the last 7 years of us learning just through this church that even though you are vulnerable sometimes, even though you need help sometimes, if you put your sweat equity into it, then you can be in a situation where you can turn that around, use what you've learned to help other people.
And being able to see what they've done with people's generosity has been amazing. But I think for us, it was kind of a hard first step to really start giving, because we still needed assistance from different groups and things like that. Like, we were thinking, well, why are we giving money when we're asking for money from places? But I think when you give to the church, I know it's been said here, you're making room for God to work. And even though that little bit of money in the offering plate you may not think it's going very far, but Jesus talked about this, how much God can do with so little if it's given from a pocket that has so little. And I think in our lives that's been proven, and we've seen the results of that. When I hear all in, I think sold out to the mission of Jesus Christ. Jesus asking people individually and collectively, what do you want to see happen? Do you want to see the same thing happening for the next 20 years at the church? Or do you want to see what I can do with what you can give? And I think there's a lot more.
What I love about being here is that there are people everywhere who are ready to just be on your team about whatever it is that you're going through. I love how involved in the community our church is. St. Paul's takes an active role in those people, people who are not that different than us or where we were.
When I didn't feel like I was good enough to be in a church, let alone work for a church or be a part of a on-stage ministry. You know, a lot of this town knows who I've been. And still, I'm on their webpage. They're not hiding me. That's that faith in action. That's what I love the most about St. Paul's. This could be huge. And I can't wait to see it.
If you come Wednesday, you're going to hear more of their story. Listen, I'm all in for stories like that. I'm all in for that, and I hope you are too. You know, this church has changed my life. And I have had the pleasure to see Nate and Amy's lives change. Churches that just feel good about what they're doing and just celebrate the good and worship the good and aren't willing to face the fear to try to do something new will eventually cease to do the good that they're doing and will quit changing lives and lose its voice and lose its mission. And I don't want to be a church like that. You know, so we talk in these terms around generosity, and I know that makes people squirm a little bit because we talk about money, and we talk, Pastor, yeah, you can talk about my time and my talents, but not about my money. Why do we talk about money? But I got to be honest with you, money is one of the most spiritual things you actually have. And I'll talk about that more next week, but just in a nutshell, money is one of the most spiritual things because it is the one thing that you think about more than anything else in your life, and you probably don't realize it. And so when it comes to being all in and saying, God, I want to follow you, it talks in generosity in a couple different ways. And I take this from my own life. When I first started following Jesus, I started to feel God do something in my life. And then I decided, you know what? I'll just start somewhere, and I call it an initial giver. You know, God, yeah, you know, I see kids that need help. I want to give a little bit. And you've never done that before. Maybe you're feeling that tug right now, and that's what you want to do. That is awesome. But for me then, it went beyond just this occasional thing to decide, you know what? Yes, God, I can do this on a regular basis. And I decided to be a consistent giver, which meant for me, fortunately, it was the digital age. And I could go online and do something that would just recur, because if it depended on me to physically have money in my wallet, you know, I'm just out of luck. But I went from there to then actually searching more and feeling this tug from God to actually become intentional about my giving. This actually then thinking, okay, what is a tithe, this 10%? What is this trust that I've got to put in God that says, you know what, I promise you can live on 90% just as good as you do on 100% if you just trust me with it. And then to say, okay, God, I'm going to intentionally trust you. Then I'm going to tithe. And then where I know that I'm at, but not every single day, I'll confess, is a surrender giver. The one time where you recognize that everything that I have comes from Jesus. And sometimes I try to convince myself that everything that I have comes because I'm very smart and intelligent and crafty and all those things. But no, a surrender giver recognizes that it all comes from Jesus. And we start to change the question from, well, God, how much do you want me to give? To God, how much do you want me to just live on so the rest is free to help this world? And then what I'm working towards next is being a lifetime giver, starting to figure out how, when I die, some of this mission can continue on to my state, those sorts of things. And that's just a little how I do it. And listen, that's in your workbook that explains it more. Listen, if you call this church home yours, these are important things to consider. Generosity is part of your faith life. And in our worship on the 23rd of February, we're going to have a big celebration around that, about what God has been calling us to do. We're going to do a commitment Sunday, and I invite you to be there, or make sure to be here on Wednesday night. But listen, just me talking about it might create some fear in you. And if that fear is there, I ask you to pray. If there's some confusion there, I ask you to pray. And it's simply this: God, where am I at? God, where do you want me to be? And then God, show me how to get there. God, where am I at? I'm a tither. Where do you want me to be? How do I get there? Listen, Felix Baumgartner, he didn't start becoming a stuntman by going 24 miles up in the air and jumping out. No, he started as a kid, jumping off the side of the pool. And then eventually the low dive, and then the high dive, and then you get the idea. He started somewhere. And as we look into the future of our church, the future of changing lives, leading people to an active faith in Jesus Christ, impacting our communities, what we do now matters, especially as it relates to what we will do in the future. To the people that don't know the love of God and the forgiveness of God, the people who maybe grew up around Christians and were told they were unwanted and unwelcome. What we do now matters. And it matters around children and youth and how we create space and ministry for them. It matters to the people in Nicaragua that we've consistently helped to take it to the next level. It is all about our mission. But listen, I know being all in will create fear. There's no way to get around it, but there is a way to get through it, and it starts with prayer. Again, just simply pray a prayer like this. God, I'm afraid. I want to be all in. I'm not quite sure what it looks like, so show me. Help me get there. Give me the courage to do it. And that's what we pray around all in. Pray with me. God, I just simply ask that whatever in the midst of this teaching, through the actions of the disciples of Paul, that somehow you will inspire us or challenge us to be a little bit better than we are. That you meet us in the midst of our fears, whether they be a financial fear or a relational fear, a faith fear. That you help us to be honest enough to say, Jesus, this is where I am. Jesus, where do you want me to be? And Jesus, give me the courage to do that. And Jesus, I ask that you honor that prayer in anybody, so that when we leave here, we are more and more like the people you called us to be. And I ask this in the name of the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen.